Eastfield Financial Center in Boston always seemed too cold for a place where entire lives changed at customer service desks. The bright white LED panels made everything clinical, almost surgical, and that's exactly how Mark Ellison, a manager for 17 years, liked it. He believed that excessive comfort encouraged customers to talk too much, and the more they talked, the more problems arose. That Tuesday, he had already dealt with 2 chargeback requests, one furious customer who had forgotten his password and blamed the bank, and another a woman insisting that someone had hacked her account because she herself didn't remember paying for the gas. Routine. A routine that required nothing more than patience, and patience was something Mark only possessed in functional quantities. Therefore, when the attendant at counter 4 came to call him, saying that a customer wanted to speak with the manager, he took a deep breath, adjusted his navy blue tie, and walked to the desk. The phrase he heard even before arriving made him mentally roll his eyes. "I just want to confirm a deposit." A phrase that appeared on average 50 times a week. He almost smiled, that tired smile of someone who already knows exactly the type of person he's about to deal with. Probably someone who had received a late payment, a misunderstood refund, or some small direct deposit from a local employer. Nothing out of the ordinary. That "I just want to confirm" always meant a small amount and a great deal of anxiety. But when Mark finally looked at the customer sitting across from him, the smile vanished before it even formed. The man was too ordinary. A calculated kind of anonymity. A plain grey coat, a black cap that hid part of his face, a rigid posture. He didn't seem nervous, he seemed alert. Every movement seemed studied, as if he were very aware of his own body. And that, for Mark, was already a silent warning. The man didn't take off his hat. He didn't take off his jacket. He didn't even take his hands out of his pockets when he greeted him. "Good morning," said the customer, his voice firm but not aggressive. "I made a transfer last night. I just want to confirm if it has gone through." Mark nodded, trying to remain natural. "Of course." "Do you have the account number?" The man handed over a small, folded piece of paper, no trembling in his hands, no sign of the anxiety common among customers waiting for money. He simply observed. His eyes were too attentive for someone who had come to confirm something routine. Mark typed in the number, opened the account history, and stopped. The deposit was there. An amount he didn't see often, $26 million, sent from an account registered under the name Redwater Holdings. The kind of sum that shouldn't be associated with someone wearing that old coat and that ordinary cap. The kind of transfer that went through internal checks, automatic alerts, and even internal audits at headquarters. The type of value that, if bound to Redwater, it meant something even more serious. The name hit him like a silent punch. He knew that company, or rather, he knew the stories about it. A murky holding company with ramifications in shell companies, the target of ongoing federal investigations, and always involved in transactions that raised eyebrows in financial sectors. The kind of name that made managers like Mark take a deep breath before continuing. But 26 million for that man. He reviewed the screen. He scanned the transfer 3 times, verifying its authenticity, cross-referencing it with internal codes. Everything there was perfectly within protocol. No inconsistencies, nothing suspicious in the records, everything right and completely wrong at the same time. Mark leaned back subtly in his chair, his brain already working too fast. That man didn't fit in. People who received that kind of money didn't show up like that, without lawyers, without appointments, without an escort, without any hurry. They didn't come in person, and they never, absolutely never, limited themselves to saying, "I just want to confirm a deposit." The man, noticing the prolonged silence, tilted his head slightly. "Is everything all right?" Mark swallowed hard, maintaining a professional tone. "Just a moment, sir. I'm checking the details." The ticket counter attendant, who had been standing nearby, cast a curious glance at Mark. He responded with a discreet nod, the kind that meant, "Get back to work and don't ask questions." The customer maintained a rigid posture, but his eyes followed Mark's every move, the keyboard, the screen, his breathing. He didn't seem impatient. He seemed vigilant. Mark considered calling the security department, or perhaps calling the regional supervisor directly. This was too big. Transfers of that size required additional verification, especially coming from Redwater. But the system marked everything as authenticated. So why would someone like that man receive 26 million? And why did he himself, Mark Ellison, an ordinary manager, feel an uncomfortable pressure on the back of his neck, as if he was sitting in front of something he shouldn't be seeing? He took a deep breath. If something was wrong there, he needed to find out without alarming anyone. At least, not yet. He looked at the customer again. And at that moment, I knew that this story was about to become much bigger than any routine consultation. Boston had a peculiar way of blending tradition and haste. Among red brick buildings, centuries-old universities, and avenues swallowed by honking horns, there was an atmosphere of constant vigilance, a place where everyone seemed to be chasing something they never quite revealed. And it was within this rhythm that Mark Ellison had built his professional life, made of rigid routines, predictability, and results. He didn't come from a wealthy family, but his father had always told him that the safest path was to choose a solid, stable, bureaucratic job. Mark had followed this advice almost as if it were law. At 48, he lived in a discreet condominium on the outskirts of the city, had driven the same grey sedan for 8 years, and maintained the same routine as always. Work, return home, prepare something quick for dinner, and watch reruns of economic news. This predictability, however, had always kept him comfortable, until now, because the man sitting across from him, the unlikely heir to a $26 million transfer, had broken something within that perfect routine. Before continuing to assist the customer, Mark decided to call him by name. It was an old technique that often revealed a little about the person. "Sir." He looked at the screen again. "Thomas Hale?" The man raised his face slightly, as if the name carried weight. "That's right." No hesitation, no story behind the voice. But the name Thomas Hale didn't ring a bell in the system. He didn't appear on lists of special clients. He had no investments, no history of significant transactions. Until the previous night, he was an ordinary citizen with a virtually inactive account, and now he was there as the recipient of one of the largest transfers the bank had recorded that quarter. Mark rested his hands on the table, not to assert authority, but to stabilize the growing unease. The bank had protocols for large balance variations, including verification of origin, automatic notification to headquarters, and, in specific cases, reports of suspicious transactions. But everything here was too clean. The system recorded the transfer as legitimate and validated. No alerts, no questions, no errors. And that, in itself, was strange. Thomas, on the other hand, showed no discomfort with the silence. He simply observed the surroundings like someone who needed to memorize every exit, every camera, every employee. There was a rigidity about him that wasn't seen in an ordinary person. It was almost military, calculated, but without the posture of someone formally trained. It was an attentiveness shaped by necessity, not by career. Mark glanced toward the checkout area. The cashiers seemed to be resuming their normal routine, but some customers glanced quickly at the table where he was sitting, perhaps just out of curiosity, perhaps because Thomas really stood out in that clean, standardized environment. And yet, nothing about him was overly obvious. That was precisely what made him remarkable. In the United States, especially in large cities like Boston, social invisibility was real for those who knew how to use it. And Thomas seemed to master it like few others. Mark opened a restricted tab in the system, one that few employees knew how to use thoroughly. It allowed him to track internal checks, automated audits, and any markings made by external parties, including federal departments. Nothing, not a single unexpected line. This transfer, Mark chose his words carefully, is unusual for an account with no recent activity. Thomas leaned forward a few millimeters. I imagine so, he replied. And is everything all right with her? Mark noticed a detail. The way the man asked wasn't that of someone concerned about the money's arrival. It was that of someone who needed to confirm if it had been done correctly, or if it had been detected by someone other than the bank. It was as if he were testing his own shadow. It's registered as completed and verified, Mark replied, maintaining a neutral tone. However, transactions of this value typically generate some additional procedures. There haven't been any triggers, which is rare. Thomas lowered his gaze for a second, as if calculating possibilities. He didn't seem surprised. He seemed to be confirming an expectation, as if that absolute silence from the system was exactly what he expected to find. Mark realized he needed to understand more of the context before making any decisions, and he couldn't do that in a straightforward way. "Do you work with Redwater Holdings?" he asked, carefully observing the reaction. Thomas looked up, and in that instant, something passed before his eyes. Not fear, not surprise, but a silent recognition. Let's just say, I have a particular interest in how they do certain things. The answer explained nothing, but it also denied nothing. It was a non-answer laden with intention. Mark felt his stomach clench. There was something bigger at stake, something much bigger than a simple transfer, and he had just walked right into the middle of it. The clock behind Mark's desk ticked almost aggressively, as if counting down the time, until something inevitable happened. He tried to maintain control of the situation, but the more he looked at Thomas Hale, the more he realized he was facing someone who hadn't come to the bank just to confirm a deposit. That was only the surface. Something much bigger was moving beneath. With the transfer already confirmed, Thomas seemed satisfied, but not relieved. It wasn't the behavior of someone expecting money. It was the behavior of someone verifying a transaction. And that bothered Mark deeply. "The verification is complete," Mark said, stepping away from the screen. "But, as I said, transactions of this size usually generate internal monitoring. I just want to make sure everything is as expected." Thomas kept his gaze steady. Yes, it was too definitive an answer, without hesitation, as if he knew the result before even asking. Mark wondered how much of that control was real and how much was a facade. He considered ending it there, but he couldn't ignore the patterns. Something didn't add up. Not about Thomas, not about Redwater Holdings, not about the lack of alerts in the system, and most importantly, not about how that man remained so utterly calm. This calm was dangerous. "Mr. Hale," Mark continued, "our bank is required to keep detailed records of all transactions above certain amounts. I may need to request some additional data, depending on how the internal audit proceeds in the coming hours." Thomas looked up with that calculated silence. "Will you need it today?" "Not yet," Mark replied, "but it might be necessary." Thomas studied Mark for a few seconds. There was no irritation, just assessment, as if he were measuring how much Mark knew and how much I would find out if I dug deeper. Then, as if he had made a sudden decision, Thomas said, "I can ask a question." Mark nodded. "How many people have access to what you just saw?" The question made the air feel heavier. "Qualified people, analysts from the audit sector, specific departments." "No," Thomas interrupted without raising his voice. "How many people have access to what? The Lord, did you just see? My name, the value, the origin, the company involved." Mark felt a lump in his throat. The question was too clear. Thomas didn't want to know about the inner workings. He wanted to know about something much simpler and much more dangerous. How many witnesses were there? Mark maintained a professional demeanor. "Right now, just me." Thomas took a deep breath, as if this confirmation were important. He looked away for a moment, observing the interior of the bank. Doors, cameras, employee positions. He analyzed everything. Everything. Mark finally realized that man wasn't there to receive the transfer. He was there to make sure it had been delivered exactly as planned, without anyone interfering. And now he had to deal with the fact that Mark Ellison knew too much. Suddenly, something happened that completely changed the energy in the bank. The revolving door at the entrance jammed. It was a subtle sound, a mechanical click that few would notice. But Mark knew that noise. The automatic locking only happened for two reasons: scheduled maintenance, which wasn't the case, or manual activation of the safety panel. And the panel was located behind the cash register counter. Mark turned instinctively. The attendant at counter 4, the same one who had brought Thomas to him, was staring at the door in confusion. He certainly hadn't touched the button, and the other cashiers hadn't done anything either. Thomas realized it before Mark did. "It's not you," he said almost in a whisper. Mark squinted. "What does that mean?" Thomas didn't answer. His eyes were fixed on something behind Mark, or beyond him. Mark turned just enough to see the reflection in the acrylic screens that separated the tables. Reflected in the glass, 3 silhouettes appeared on the sidewalk, standing in front of the glass doors. They wore long coats, sunglasses, and kept their hands in their pockets. That posture, that stillness, that silent tension. Something was about to happen. Mark felt the adrenaline surge. "Are you being followed?" Mark asked, his voice lower. Thomas did not deny it. He did not confirm it. He simply said, "I need to get out of here." Mark looked at the locked door, then at the security guards inside, then at Thomas. He was in the middle of something he didn't understand, and there was no way out. The tension was building so rapidly it seemed to radiate from the walls. The men outside weren't moving. Thomas leaned forward. "Listen," he said very quietly. "If someone comes in here, you'll see nothing but confirmation of the transfer. Nothing about the origin. Nothing about me. Nothing about the amount." "Why?" Mark whispered. Thomas answered without taking his eyes off the entrance. "Because some people can't know that I received this money. And if they find out that you know, you're not leaving this bank today." The phrase hit Mark like a blow. And that's when the revolving door unlocked itself. The 3 men went inside, and Mark finally understood that the conflict brewing there was far greater than anything he had ever faced in his life. The 3 men walked through the revolving door as if entering a pre-mapped environment. None of them looked to the sides. They proceeded in a straight line, with synchronized steps, as if they were part of a single unit. The bank's internal security noticed the movement immediately. The guard on the left side of the hall reached for the radio strapped to his shoulder. The other, near the service desks, straightened up, assessing the risk. Mark felt his pulse quicken. Thomas didn't stand up, but his posture changed completely. His body stiffened, ready to move at any second. The rigidity wasn't fear, it was preparedness. One of the 3 men, the one in the center, the tallest one, stepped forward. He addressed himself not to Thomas, but to Mark. "Good morning," he said with a clear American accent. "Excuse the interruption. I'm from the Financial Compliance Department. We need to ask you some questions about a recent transfer." Thomas took a deep breath, almost imperceptibly. That compliance department didn't sound official. There was no visual identification, no visible badge, no documentation. It was a facade. A subplot was emerging. It wasn't just Thomas who was hiding something. Those 3 men had also come with a specific agenda, and nothing in their demeanor indicated actual protocol. Mark tried to stay in control. "What kind of transfer?" he asked, avoiding looking directly at Thomas. The man offered a slight, almost cordial smile. "We received a federal alert regarding a transaction linked to Redwater Holdings. We need to confirm who accessed the data and which employee validated the transaction this morning." That phrase was too dangerous. They knew exactly what they were looking for, and above all, they knew that Mark was the key. Thomas spoke before Mark could respond. "There's no need to involve the manager. He only confirmed something in the system. Nothing more." The taller man finally turned to Thomas, and the air around them seemed to change. "Mr. Hale, isn't it?" the man said, as if he already knew. "We need to talk to you too." Thomas stood up slowly. His hands were visible in a peaceful gesture, but there was deep determination in his eyes. "If you needed to speak to me through official channels, you would have shown up yesterday," he said, without aggression. "So, let's save time. Who sent you?" The man did not answer. Instead, he leaned forward slightly. "Where is the rest?" Mark frowned. "The rest? The rest of what?" Thomas remained motionless. "I don't have what you're looking for." The phrase hung in the air like a shard about to cut. The other two men began to move discreetly around the hall, as if they were mere observers, but Mark noticed that they were strategically positioned, one near the side exits, the other close to the corridor leading to the inner offices. They were blocking the entire perimeter. The subplot was now clear. This wasn't just about the transfer. There was another quest going on, something Thomas was carrying, or should be carrying, that was somehow connected to the 26 million. Mark felt his stomach churn. "Sir." The tall man turned to him again, his posture too calm. "We need to access your desk for a few minutes. Standard procedure. It won't take long." Mark knew he wasn't conforming, and he knew he had no choice. Internal security was watching, but they were waiting for some kind of signal from him, and he had no signal to give. He began, but Thomas interrupted him with a quick glance. Not a request. A warning. It was as if he were saying, if you let them, they'll find something that shouldn't be there. But Mark didn't understand. How could those men be looking for something on his desk? And why? Then he realized something that chilled his blood. When Thomas stood up, one of the men discreetly leaned over to try and see what was in his inside pocket. They weren't looking for money. They were looking for an object, proof, a document, something Thomas possessed. And if they found it, it would all end there. Mark took a deep breath. "I need to see your identification," he said, finally asserting the authority he still possessed. The three men stopped. The silence that followed was thick, dense, aggressive. The man in the center smiled, but there was no sympathy in that smile. "Of course," he said, slowly opening his jacket. Mark waited for a badge. What he saw was worse. Inside the pocket, there was only an empty holster. The man looked Mark in the eyes. "Get out of the way." The tension, which had been contained until then, exploded in the room. Before Mark could answer, Thomas moved. Not fast, strategic. He took 2 steps to the side, creating an angle that made it difficult for the man blocking the exit to approach directly. Internal security finally realized this was outside protocol and moved forward. The nearest guard raised his arm. "Gentlemen, I need you to—" He didn't finish the sentence. One of the men pulled something from his pocket. Not a weapon, but a small, rectangular black device. He clicked it. The lights in the bank flickered. The camera system flickered. The doors locked again. Mark realized with a chill down his spine that the entire bank had just been isolated, and that he was caught in the middle of something he could never have foreseen. The dry crack of the doors locking echoed through the bank like a final warning. A simple sound, but one that carried a devastating message. No one would enter. No one would leave. For a few seconds, the entire atmosphere remained suspended, as if the air had been trapped along with everyone inside. The device the man had activated emitted a discreet light, almost invisible under the white lighting of the hall. But its effects were clear. The screens flickered, parts of the system crashed and restarted in rapid cycles, as if fighting off external interference. The panel controlling the doors now displayed only a continuous red symbol. Mark felt his throat tighten. He wasn't prepared to deal with that kind of situation. Years of experience in finance didn't include training for confronting men who broke into a bank with an electronic jammer. The guard who had tried to intervene took a step back, instinctively reaching for his weapon, but stopped when the tall man raised a finger, a simple gesture that said, "Don't try." There was something in the demeanor of those men that transcended explicit threats. They weren't ordinary criminals, and they weren't police officers. They were something in limbo, a dangerous category operating between legality and force. Thomas, for his part, didn't seem surprised. Worried, yes. Alerted, yes, but not surprised. It was as if he had foreseen that this type of intervention could happen. Perhaps not there, perhaps not so soon, but inevitably. Mark finally found his voice. "You can't just isolate the bank," he said, his voice trembling more than he would have liked. The tall man stared at him. "We can. And we did. And it will continue like this until we resolve what we came here to find." That confirmed everything. There was no protocol, no compliance department. They were after something specific, and Thomas Hale was at the center of it. Thomas took a step forward, approaching the man who appeared to be the leader. "I already said," he repeated firmly, "that I have nothing to do with you." "And I already said," the man replied equally calmly, "that I don't believe it." The shorter man on the left began circling the room like a hunting dog. He approached the cashiers, the tables, the customers who were now watching everything with growing panic. Some people instinctively pulled out their cell phones, but the electronic jammer reduced them to expensive bricks. No signal, no calls. No hope of calling for help. Thomas observed this attentively, weighing the risks. Mark felt the weight of responsibility explode in his chest. He was the manager. Those customers were under his supervision, even if they weren't there through any fault of his own. He tried to speak again. The bank's security system should have already registered the interference. The bank's security system, the tall man interrupted, responds to another system, one we're much more familiar with. Mark didn't understand right away, but Thomas did, and that was enough to make him move. No one expected it. None of the three men anticipated it. Not even Mark saw the gesture. Thomas leaped onto the side table, knocking over a stack of forms, and ran toward the internal emergency panel. A red box, partially hidden behind a column. He knew exactly where it was. The tall man reacted first. "No!" The other two moved forward immediately. Thomas pulled the lever on the dashboard. Nothing happened. He pulled again. The electronic blocker neutralized the emergency system. The tall man smiled slightly as he approached. "Did you really think it would be that easy?" Thomas stepped back, his eyes frantically scanning the room. He was calculating exits, possibilities, risks. It was obvious he didn't have a complete plan, only urgency. An urgency that was now colliding with an invisible barrier. Mark was trapped between two worlds, the bureaucratic one and the now violent one. "I don't have what you want," Thomas repeated, but now his voice showed a crack. The tall man tilted his head. "I'm not talking about the money." That made Thomas stop. Mark felt the impact of the phrase like a direct punch. It wasn't about the 26 million. It was about something beyond that. Something associated with the transfer, but not contained within it. Thomas closed his eyes for a moment. And then finally, he said something that completely changed the course of history. "You're late." "Very late." The tall man narrowed his eyes. "What does that mean?" Thomas took a deep breath. "That means I no longer have the file." The silence that followed was absolute. That was the turning point. Everything converged on that moment. The men weren't after the money. They were looking for a file, something Thomas once had, something he no longer had, something that apparently could change a lot of things. The leader took a step forward. "Where is it?" Thomas opened his eyes, clear again. "In a place where neither you nor Redwater nor anyone else can erase it." Mark felt his stomach drop. The name Redwater returned like an even larger shadow. It wasn't just a suspicious holding company. It was the center of something much deeper, and Thomas was directly connected to it. The tall man lost his temper for the first time. "Where is the file?" he asked, his voice firm, but lower, more dangerous. Thomas did not answer. The man smiled. "Very well. Let's find out the hard way." He nodded to the other two. The three of them began to get closer to Thomas, and then someone on the bench, Mark never knew who, shouted, "Chaos has begun," and the fate of everyone inside that hall changed direction once and for all. The scream shattered the air like a shard of glass, cutting through the invisible tension that hung over the bank. It was impossible to identify who let it out first. A panicked customer, an employee who had lost control, or perhaps Mark himself without realizing it. What mattered was the immediate trigger. The atmosphere, until then trapped in a tense silence, erupted in motion. Customers rushed back, crowding against the reinforced glass wall. The claustrophobia of the locked space made it seem as if the bank had suddenly shrunk. Tables were pushed, chairs toppled, and a woman spilled her coffee on the floor, the dark liquid spreading like a fresh shadow. The two men accompanying the leader lunged violently at Thomas, but he instinctively dodged, using the nearby table for cover. The sound of scraping metal and wood echoed like a prelude to something worse. Mark froze, his brain struggling to keep up with the avalanche of stimuli. He needed to protect his clients, he needed to protect his team, and at the same time, he needed to survive. He felt crushed by an impossible responsibility. His eyes searched for the bank guard, who had already drawn his weapon. His arm trembled slightly. He was trained to deal with robberies, but this was no ordinary robbery. These were men operating with technology, precision, and, above all, with information that no one there had. "Put your weapon down," the leader ordered, turning to the guard without deviating from his advance toward Thomas. The guard hesitated. His hand was steady, but his face betrayed fear. He aimed, but didn't shoot. "I said lower it." The leader's voice wasn't loud, but it carried a cold certainty that made one tremble. Thomas, seizing the moment, ran behind a column. The shorter man followed him, while the other held his position near the door. Mark finally moved. He took a few steps toward the counter, trying to get everyone's attention. "Guys, calm down. Everyone stay together. Move away from them." But no one listened. Terror dominated individual decisions. Each person reacted in their own way. Some ducked behind furniture, others cried, one or two shouted the name of someone who was outside, as if that could break the electronic lockdown. The device's technology was terrifying. Cell phones were dead, doors were immobilized, and now the internal security system was displaying glitches, lines flickering on the screens, as if trying to withstand something bigger than their programming could handle. The leader advanced toward the column where Thomas was trying to hide. "You had a chance," he said. "Now let's do it the way it needs to be done." Thomas was breathing rapidly. He seemed to be calculating, observing, searching for something in his surroundings. Then, and this surprised even Mark, who was watching from afar, Thomas left the column, raised his hands, and didn't run anymore. "Wait," he said, his voice firm despite the evident fear. "If you take me now, without knowing where the file is, you'll lose everything, and I know you can't afford that." The leader stopped. It was only a second, but it was enough. The second man, however, did not stop. He grabbed Thomas by the arm, twisting forcefully, trying to immobilize him. Thomas shouted. The customer's reaction was immediate. More screams, more chaos. The guard raised his weapon again, but didn't fire. A millisecond error could turn the entire bank into a scene of tragedy. Mark felt his heart pounding as if trying to escape from his ribs. He wanted to intervene. He wanted to do something, anything, to stop the escalation. The leader raised his hand, ordering the man to release Thomas. "He's right," he murmured. "We still need the information." Thomas fell to his knees, clutching his arm, breathless. "I can help you," he said, looking at the leader, "but not this way. You know this file isn't simple. If you try to force me, you'll be wasting your time. And time is something you clearly don't have." The leader blinked slowly, evaluating each word. There was truth there. "It's dangerous." "Where is it?" he asked again. Thomas hesitated, and in that instant, Mark noticed something different in his gaze. It wasn't just fear, it was strategy. Thomas still had something hidden, something no one knew. Silence returned to the room, this time filled with expectation, not shock. "The file is protected," Thomas replied, "and it can only be accessed by two people. I am one of them." The leader narrowed his eyes, and the other one? Thomas took a deep breath. "I am not authorized to say." That caused the leader to lose his temper completely. He approached roughly, grabbed Thomas by the shirt, and pushed him against the glass wall. "You are not in a position to negotiate." The impact made a hollow sound, like a badly tuned drum. The customers screamed again. Mark couldn't take it anymore. "Stop!" he shouted, taking a step forward. "You're going to hurt someone. If you want him, take him, but let everyone else go." The three men looked at Mark. He swallowed hard, realizing too late that he had just attracted unwanted attention. The leader let go of Thomas, who fell to the ground again and took a few steps towards Mark. "You don't understand anything," he said. "No one leaves until we resolve this. Not him, not you, not anyone." His gaze was so cold that Mark felt his whole body tremble. The customers were crying, some were trembling. One woman leaned on another person to avoid falling. Two teenagers hid their faces behind a backpack. And then, for the first time since it all began, Thomas looked directly at Mark. There was a silent plea there, a request that read, "Get ready, something bigger is coming," and it was indeed. Because at that instant, something in the security system, something that should have been dead, lit up again. A blue light, small, but impossible to ignore. The consequences of the chaos were only beginning. The news of the arrest warrant for Richard Vaughan hit New York like an electric storm. Within hours, reporters were circling the financial building where he had for decades orchestrated discreet schemes that seemed impossible to trace. Now, however, the city's most untouchable man sat in a stuffy interrogation room, elbows resting on the metal table, eyes half closed, while federal agents sifted through evidence that seemed to emerge from every corner. Liam, outside, watched the agents coming and going with a neutral, almost cold expression. There was no pride on his face, no satisfaction, just a focused state, as if every piece of what had happened in the last few weeks was finally falling into place. But the final piece that truly made sense was still missing. He had seen powerful men fall before. That in itself didn't impress him. What mattered was the fact that Vaughan wasn't reacting like someone defeated. He seemed prepared. Meanwhile, the agency moved like a living organism. Documents revealed by the mysterious transfer continued to be examined by parallel teams. There were connections to shell companies on the West Coast, deposits originating from banks in Nevada, and a trail of transactions that, despite appearing random, followed an almost mathematical pattern. The strangest thing was that each one pointed to people who had disappeared years before: small businessmen, silent investors, mid-level employees. All had been reported dead or missing under different circumstances, with no direct connection to each other. But now, there was a line connecting them all. Richard Vaughan. Tension mounted as Liam received fragments of information and tried to mentally organize them. He knew he couldn't get distracted, not this time. The climax was approaching, and everything indicated that Vaughan was going to play one last card before being officially indicted. The team knew it. The city knew it. And judging by the relaxed posture Vaughan himself maintained in the interrogation room, he knew it too. That night, Liam reviewed the files once more. It was the same repeated sequence: numbers, transfers, dates, destinations, until something caught his attention. A small detail that had almost gone unnoticed. A very old deposit, about 20 years earlier, appeared as the first movement in the chain that culminated in the transfer of $47 million to his own name. The sender of this deposit was an organization that, officially, had ceased to exist after an arson attack. But that wasn't the most relevant part. What really mattered was the recipient at the time, a very discreet bank in Ohio, belonging to a single person, Liam's father. He froze. It wasn't possible. That bank had been liquidated while Liam was still in college. His father had never mentioned suspicious transactions, never shown any involvement with people like Vaughn. He was a simple, pragmatic man, rigid on moral issues, and yet there was the record, signed, authenticated, reviewed, confirming that the first link in the chain that now bound Vaughn had begun with a deposit made to the family bank. A silent pressure gripped Liam's chest. He knew he couldn't interpret this before checking everything. He needed to stay in control. But the nagging thought settled in. Someone had been trying to manipulate the narrative from the start. Not just to take down Vaughn, but to put him at the center of the story, to involve Liam personally, to use him. The following morning, before he could discuss the finding with the team, Vaughn asked to speak with him, and only him. The agents hesitated, but agreed, trusting that it was just another desperate attempt at negotiation. When Liam entered the room, he found the banker with a slight smile, as if he already knew what the agent had discovered. His posture wasn't that of someone cornered. It was that of someone on the verge of revealing what really mattered, and then he said, "You shouldn't just be investigating who I was transferring money to, but who I was obeying." Liam didn't answer. He didn't blink, but a chill ran down his spine. "You'll realize that the deposit you received was never about me," Vaughn finished, leaning slightly. "It was about you." The build-up to the climax was no longer just professional. Now it was personal, and it was about to explode. The corridor leading to Richard Vaughn's temporary cell seemed narrower that morning. Liam walked with measured steps, each breath too heavy for someone so accustomed to tension. What Vaughn had said earlier, the insinuation that he wasn't the real target of the story, echoed in the agent's mind like a shrill siren. He tried, in vain, to push away the idea that his father, dead for years, was somehow connected to this whole underground operation. Upon entering the room, he found Vaughn seated, handcuffed to the table, but with the same posture as someone in control. It was irritating. It was threatening. "You're restless, Liam," Vaughn said, tilting his head. "Good sign. A sign that you're finally getting it." Understanding what? Liam's voice came out firm, but not as firm as he would have liked. The banker interlaced his fingers as if preparing a speech he had saved for decades. "You're not the first on that list, and you definitely won't be the last." The phrase landed like a stone. Vaughn observed every micro-expression of the agent, like a predator analyzing its prey before pouncing. "What do you know about my father?" Liam hadn't intended to ask that, much less so directly. But the doubt gnawed at his composure. Vaughn chuckled softly, a short, dry laugh. "Everything. At least everything that matters." With a minimal gesture of his handcuffed hand, he indicated for Liam to approach. The officer didn't move. Vaughn continued anyway. "He wasn't just an ordinary banker in Ohio. He was my predecessor. Without him knowing it, of course. They used his bank as a starting point for much larger operations. His father thought he was just helping harmless clients, but there were people behind them, real people." Vaughn's expression deepened, as if reliving that story gave him a dark energy. "When his bank went bankrupt, they thought all the loose ends had been tied up. But then you came along." She smiled as she joined the financial investigation team. They smiled too. Liam took a deep breath, trying to distinguish truth from manipulation. "So who made the transfer to me?" he asked. Vaughn looked up, staring directly into his eyes. "It wasn't me. It was never me." And then he leaned forward slightly. "You're being tested, Liam, and you haven't even realized yet that you've spent most of your life following clues they left for you. Like your father." Before Liam could respond, a loud bang echoed through the floor, followed by an abrupt power outage. The lights went out completely, and for a few seconds, absolute silence filled the building, until the metallic sound of security doors locking automatically began to spread like a continuous hum. The room plunged into total darkness. Liam quickly pulled out the flashlight, illuminating Vaughan's face. The banker showed no surprise. On the contrary, he seemed pleased. "Welcome to the point of no return," Vaughan murmured. "They arrived sooner than I expected." An alarm began to sound in the hallways. Dust barely rose from the ceiling, as if a generator were being pushed to its limit. Liam opened the door to the room, but the hallway was filled with smoke, not from a fire, from a jamming device. He recognized it immediately. Someone had hacked into the ventilation system with the clear intention of causing confusion. "They are isolating us," he thought. "And someone wants Vaughan before he says more." He turned quickly to the banker. "Who are they?" "Ah, Liam." Vaughan smiled in an almost paternal way. "If you still need to ask, then you've already lost." The agent took a deep breath and, without a second thought, pulled Vaughan from the table, breaking the handcuff seal with the key he was carrying. If someone was trying to get the banker, then there was more at stake than anything revealed so far. The smoke thickened. Liam grabbed Vaughan by the arm and dragged him down the hallway as the emergency lighting system finally switched on, a red glow that gave the place the air of a bunker about to explode. They turned down the first corridor when three figures in tactical gear appeared, masked, moving with military precision. They weren't federal agents. Liam knew that immediately. "Back!" he shouted, shoving Vaughan into a small maintenance room. Silenced gunshots rang out, hitting the wall next to his head. Liam closed the door and turned the inside lock. The room was narrow, full of cables and electrical panels. Vaughan was breathing rapidly, but he didn't seem panicked. "You won't be able to stop them." "Who are they?" Liam shouted, this time without any restraint. Vaughan stared at him with a terrifying calm. "The owners of the chessboard, the same ones who used your father. And now they're using you." The door suffered the first impact, then the second. The metal vibrated. Liam drew his weapon, took his position, and felt his heart pound like a hammer. Everything hung by a thread. Literally seconds before that door gave way, and the truth burst forth along with the masked men. The climax was there, suffocating, brutal, inevitable, and nothing would be the same after that moment. The door finally gave way before Liam could finish adjusting his aim. The metal bent like paper, ripped away by the masked figures who advanced with surgical precision. He fired twice, not to kill, but to buy seconds, and he did. The bullets ricocheted, forcing the attackers to retreat just enough for Liam to grab Vaughan by the collar and drag him behind, escaping down a narrow maintenance corridor that wasn't even on the building's official maps. The emergency siren blared throughout the basement, mingled with the heavy footsteps of the invaders. Every movement was tense, every breath counted, but Liam remained focused. He wasn't just trying to survive, he was trying to get to answers before someone erased them forever. He managed to reach the service stairs. He climbed up, pushing Vaughan ahead, even though the banker's legs were trembling. When they emerged into the underground parking garage, they found an artificial, cold light, almost too clean to match the violence unfolding on the floor below. But they were not alone. A black SUV without license plates waited with its engine running. Its interior lights revealed the silhouette of a woman behind the wheel. She didn't seem surprised to see them. On the contrary, she looked up as if confirming a delivery. Liam raised his weapon immediately. "Don't worry," Vaughan said, straightening his torn jacket. "She's not here to kill you." The woman smiled, a minimal, technical, professional smile. "Liam Turner," he called, with an indefinable accent. "You're coming with me." "Absolutely not." She tilted her head slightly, as if lamenting a predictable refusal. "I didn't come here to argue. I came to finish what started 20 years ago." The sentence made the air seem heavier. Liam approached, without lowering his weapon. "Who sent you? Who's behind this?" The woman opened the passenger door. "Do you really want to hear that answer right here, right now?" She looked at Vaughan. He already knows how it ends. Vaughn sighed, tired, almost defeated. Liam, if you stay, you'll die without finding out anything. If you go with her, maybe you'll live long enough to understand. The agent hesitated. The building behind them roared with the movement of the intruders. He had seconds and a single chance to get out of there and continue his search for the truth. Then he slowly lowered the weapon and got into the SUV. The woman shifted gears without looking back. Vaughn stood motionless in the parking lot, as if he were handing over his own piece on the chessboard. As the car sped into the access tunnel, Liam turned to the woman. "Where are we going?" She smiled again, that restrained, cold, calculated smile. "Find out who actually made the transfer." Liam's heart raced. "And who was it?" The answer came calmly, almost softly. "Someone you thought you knew very well." Before he could ask any more questions, the SUV plunged into the dark tunnel, disappearing beneath the city. The game was far from over. 2 days later, Liam watched from the window of the makeshift room where they had placed him. He didn't know where he was, only that he was no longer an ordinary agent nor a spectator. He was a central piece in something bigger, silent and ancient. The woman came and went from the room without explaining anything, only saying that the contact would arrive soon. When the door finally opened, Liam needed a second to breathe. He was someone she hadn't seen since her father's funeral. "It's been a while, Liam," the figure said calmly. "We need to talk about the bank." If this story has stirred in you the same unease that has accompanied Liam since the first deposit, share your impressions, theories, and interpretations. Every detail may hide a new connection, and your reflections may reveal relationships that no investigator has yet found. Share the story with those who appreciate plots full of mystery, power games, and unexpected twists. The more people delve into this enigma, the more layers can be discovered, and perhaps, together, they will reveal who is really moving the pieces on this invisible chessboard.